Hello and welcome to part 3 of the 200th anniversary of El Periquillo Sarniento. I actually recorded part 1 on March 20th of this year, 2022, and one thing I mentioned in part 1, which I didn't cover in part 2, I mentioned it was curious that it took 300 years from the time that Columbus discovered America in 1492 until the very first Spanish-American novel was ever published in 1816. And I mentioned at the time that that was another video and another discussion for another time. So I think I'm finally up to the task of doing that today. In part 2, if you followed my part 2, I didn't mention that at all. So I will tell you that for much of the time, much of those 300 years, there was censorship on the part of Spain for writers who wanted to publish something in Latin America. And you can kind of understand that, why there would be censorship, because Spain had a pretty huge empire of colonies from Mexico all the way to the tip of South America. Of course, not all that land was theirs, but quite a bit was. And at one point, I think there were times that the censorship, the requirements of the censorship was a little less stringent at some times and more stringent at other times. But from what I've heard and what I've read in my studies in graduate school, at one point, you really almost had to be wealthy to get something published, at least something the size of a novel, because at one point they required someone to already have self-published a copy of the book, and the person had to jump on a ship to Spain, sail all the way across the Atlantic to Spain and present the book in person, and then wait for the approval. And so you can see why I say that you'd have to be wealthy for all that. You'd probably have to be independently wealthy, because that's a lot of time off from work, and back then they probably didn't even pay vacation time. But if you were lucky enough to have vacation time where you could go without pay, who knows how long they would have held on to the job for you. Because let's face it, that's quite a few weeks sailing over there, sailing back, and who knows how long it would have taken for the authorities in Spain to actually read the novel. So yeah, I mean, probably very few writers. That probably curtailed greatly the writers who were able to try to publish something of that length. So let's kind of expand on this a little bit. And there were things that were published before the first novel was published. There were some shorter works. I think maybe in part the reasons why some of these were easier to publish. One of the very first things that was published was actually by a Spaniard, but it was considered a Latin American work. He actually did kind of chronicles about his trip to the New World and his experiences there. And he was one of the people involved in the early conquest of the New World. So, I mean, he was one of them. He was part of Spain, so I don't think there'd really be much censorship needed there. And then not all, but some of the writings were of a spiritual, religious nature. And how much censorship would Spain really need for that? But really, the biggest reason for the censorship is when you have an empire, that many colonies, I think you would be worried, wouldn't you, about maybe someone writing something about your country that would fan the flames and kind of get people riled up or thinking about breaking away independence. So that was one of the big reasons why censorship was so important. And then I think, and this may explain, if they weren't quite that stringent all the time, requiring people to actually sail from the New World over to Spain, if they weren't that stringent all the time, I do have something to tell you about Spain's history that might explain that. In the 1700s and into the early 1800s, France had really grown in its influence, and Spain actually had to surrender some of its smaller territories to France. This was during the Bourbon dynasty, And then in 1807, 1808, right around there, and that would have been when Fernandez de Lizardi would have been in his early 30s. Spain found itself actually sorry, sub, subjugated to France during Napoleon's reign. So they were kind of a puppet regime then. Spain still had some autonomy as a country, including being able to manage their colonies in the New World. But let's face it, autonomous or not, the final word still, or the final approval still would go all the way up to France and to Napoleon. So no matter how you slice it, in a way, I think it's kind of like being a puppet regime. And this couldn't have been lost on the people in the New World. And when you think about it, I'm sure there was some pride in their homeland, and maybe the idea, especially as generation after generation passed, maybe we'd like to be our own country, especially since Spain, being in Europe, was thousands and thousands of miles away. You could kind of see that to begin with. But even if you were a really loyal person in your country, and even if you had a love for Spain, and you were willing to set all those things aside and accept, I'm part of Spain. Mexico was actually called Nueva España, New Spain. I don't think all the other countries were, but Mexico was called that. Even if you were willing to express your love for Mother Spain and accept all that, that you wanted to be part of that country and aligned with it. Once this happened with France, imagine how you would feel, the country that you've kind of pledged allegiance to all these years, and then around 1807, 1808, suddenly you see Spain weakened. There's no way that they didn't find that out. Even if Spain kind of tried to keep the news from them, eventually they would have found out, with a lot of travelers coming in and out of that part of the world. So yeah, I mean, not only that, but France being a third party, a country that they hadn't pledged any kind of allegiance to at all, you could kind of imagine, I mean, if you were in those shoes of those people, maybe you'd kind of be frustrated. Enough is enough. Let's just break away. We've been thinking about it for centuries. Let's just do it now. So when Spain found itself confronted with that, kind of being under the tutelage of France, really not being what it was, not being at its zenith any longer, you can understand that why perhaps the censorship took on a whole new level and was maybe a little bit more stringent. And yeah, as I say, 1807, 1808, when Spain did find itself really kind of almost like a French territory, that's when Fernandez de Lizardi was kind of in his prime. So yeah, I think this may have a lot to do what was going on with Spain and France. If that did happen, as I'd been told, about how you had to actually sail there to Spain in person and present your book, why that was the case. So sometime after that time when Napoleon subjugated Spain, the freedom of the press kind of vacillated back and forth. There were times where Spain allowed a little bit more freedom to write whatever you wanted, and sometimes they didn't. And Lizardi certainly took advantage of that. But sometimes, even when he was completely within his rights to be a little more open, he got arrested anyway. There were people, especially people from the church, the Catholic Church, who really did not like a lot of what he had to say, who did whatever they had to do, wielded whatever power they had to do to get him arrested. And he was jailed at least 3 times, maybe 4 times. And one of the times that he was jailed was in this time after 1808. As I recall, I think that time that he was jailed was one of his longest confinements. So around the time that he finally did publish Periquillo Sarniento, his novel, It started off in 3 volumes, and it actually was a compilation of a serial that he wrote for the pamphlets that were sold in the street. Those had already been approved, and I think one of the reasons why they had been approved and they weren't really subject to scrutiny was because it was kind of a watered down criticism. He didn't really write articles as much as he wrote stories with characters, and so he disguised some of his criticism in the characters and the stories, and it wasn't quite so blatant or quite so caustic that he got into trouble. But beyond that, a lot of his criticism was not all about Spain. I mean, some of it was, but I think much more of his criticism was about Mexico and about the whole Mexican culture and society. So, to begin with, the way that he wrote these stories, the criticism was diluted to begin with, but it didn't have a whole lot to do with Spain. A little bit, but not a lot. So he was able to kind of slip through the cracks. So when it came time, when there was an interest in actually compiling all these serial pamphlets from the story that he wrote over time into volumes, well, did it really need that much censorship since this had already been out in the public eye and had been approved? So it started off as 3 volumes at least. It may have been 4. I remember 3. But eventually it went from 3 volumes to just 1 volume. And as I've mentioned before, the unabridged version is over 1,100 pages. The abridged version is much shorter, typically about 425 pages. And I do want to just set the record straight. Towards the end of part 1, I was telling you that I usually read the unabridged version. False. I usually read the abridged version. I did read the unabridged version one time, those 1,100 pages for a term paper that I was doing in graduate school, and I didn't have to. I just thought it would be helpful. But after that, anytime I have a hankering to revisit El Periquillo Sarniento, I read the abridged version. I really don't have time to plow through all those digressions that interrupted the main plot of the story. So I think I've covered everything here that I wanted to say about why it took so long for the first novel to ever be published. And so, as I say, there's more than one theory, but I hope that my theory of the things that I've heard and the things that I've read, and as I say, the gaps that I tried to fill in just using logic, I hope that my theory is maybe one that you found interesting today. So, again, thank you for listening. Bye.